For this project, I want to make a desk caddy that's going to hold everything that would typically go on your desk. And it's going to have a little bit of a surprise in it. So this should be an interesting project. Let's get started. For this project, I'm going to use some rough cut sapele. So what I got to do first is go over there and mill it down to a thickness and put a straight edge on it. And once I have a thickness established, I'm going to hit the pencil and paper and come up with a good design plan for this project. There's two ways to do this correctly, and I'm not doing either one of them. One way would be to run this board over a jointer on one side to get one flat side before I come over here and use the thickness planer. Now, I don't have a jointer that's that wide, so the second thing that I could do is create a sled where I can wedge underneath the board where the high sides are, so that the planer don't flatten it down, and then run it through the thickness planer to get its thickness. Fortunately, the cuts that I was taking out of that board were small enough that it allowed me to get away with it on this one. Alright, so I gave this a lot of thought, and this is what I come up with. These are going to be my 5 boxes that I'm going to have laid out. And as you can see here, all these spaces between them, and then around it is going to be bordered with this sapele that I have here. Now, I was going to run them sideways around, but then what I realized was I'll end up gluing side grain into end grain, and that's don't make for a good joint. So you end up having to reinforce it with dowels or biscuit joints or dominoes or whatever you end up coming up with to reinforce it. So I'm going to try to avoid that and try to run everything straight up and down. The whole way around. That way all my glue joints are side glue to side glue, so that they should get a good joint and hold together forever. But yeah, so what I did here was I took my piece of sapele, I chopped it up, and I glued them up side to side, so that I should be able to get the lengths I need to go around this thing and have my grains facing upwards. So now I'll go over to my miter saw and chop them up and try to get some good mitered corners. What we do is we run everything through the router table to put a nice 1/4 inch slot in here for a belly pan. The whole way around, then this piece here will get cut off just above this, so that the one belly pan can go the whole way through there. But yeah, I forgot to do that on camera, so I'll just have to tell you to do it. So now I'll chop off the bottom of that piece. It's going to go through the middle of it. That way the one bottom piece will go through the whole entire thing instead of having to chop it up into multiple parts. Before gluing all this thing together, it's a good idea to sand all the insides of all the pieces. That way you don't have to sand after everything's all glued up, because getting your hands in those tight little nooks and crannies, it's going to be a little bit of a pain. So save yourself the heartache later and just go ahead and sand now. Alright, so I'm glued the box together, and I'm using painter's tape to hold all my corners together. And what you see me doing here is addressing a mistake I made in cutting this thing up. I miter 45-degree angles the whole way down those pieces, where once you get to the bottom half of them pieces, you need that to be straight, because that's where the other part of the box is going to glue straight to. So I needed to cut off some little 45s to glue in there to fix that problem. That's what I'm doing right now. In the end, I'm going to end up using dowels to hold that joint together, because this kind of did away with my confidence in that joint. So I ended up having to use some dowels to hold everything together. Alright, so I'm going to let that part dry. It'll be nice and square, and then we'll be able to glue the rest of it together while sliding that panel in there. I think I might run some dowels in there to join them together there, just for a little bit extra reinforcement, because that's not a lot of material joining these two pieces together. So we'll give it a little bit of help. But yeah, we'll let that dry, and then we'll get to this piece next. While that's drying, I'm going to go over to the drill press and the spindle sander, and I'm going to cut some finger grooves in the faceplate. That'll all make sense later on. Alright, so now I'm going to drill my dowel holes for the dowels that's going to hold my boxes together here. For the dowels, I'm just chopping up some 1/4-inch dowel rods that you can buy at your local Lowe's or Home Depot. Alright, so now I'll cut out the belly pan for this. Now what I'll do is I'll measure and put marks on my piece that I'm going to cut, and then I'll measure out the width from my blade to my fence. That way I get the perfect width on my piece. And then I'll put painter's tape right down the middle of where I measured on the piece and the whole way around it. That way whenever I cut it, it don't splinter the edges of the plywood there. Alright, now we'll get this thing glued together. It's definitely an awkward thing to clamp together, but I think we got through it alright here. Whatever you do, don't forget to slide that belly pan in at this point, because if you glue that thing together without putting that pan in there, it's yeah, then we got to come up with something new to figure that out. And I'll use the painter's tape to get the clamping pressure for the corners. It does a pretty good job with that. But down where I have the dowels at, I'm going to need to clamp them somehow, because painter's tape isn't going to hold them straight across like that. So we'll have to break out some clamps for those joints. And while that's drying, I'm going to cut out my X dividers for the space at the top. Then I will glue them in and clamp them in nice and tight. Then when the clamps come off, I'll start putting some stuff inside this thing and see if I can come up with more issues there. Yeah, that'll definitely end up being a problem. So I'm going to end up having to glue another divider in there. That way your pencils can't just fall straight to the bottom of that thing. That's better. Alright, now I'm going to get started on a secret bottom compartment for this thing. For this one, I'm not going to run the grain straight up and down. I'm going to just run the grain around sideways. So I'm going to have to do something a little bit different with the joinery. I think I'm going to go with splines on this one. Doing the same thing with the bottom on it. Just going to be a loose shaker bottom. So we're going to cut it the same way with our painter's tape on it to stop it from splintering out. This being one big piece, it's going to be a much easier glue up. I'm going to use painter's tape on the corners and use that as my clamps to glue this thing together. Again, don't forget to slide your bottom in when you do this. Then I'll use my spline jig on my table saw to put 1/8 of an inch slits in the corners of this thing. I'm going to go with 2 slits for each corner. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to fill those slits with some hickory that I milled down to 1/8 of an inch. That way it has a different color to it too. And it'll tightly fill those slits and create a nice tight bond so that it strengthens those corners up. There's a couple ways you can go about strengthening these joints, but this one here is my favorite. I just like the way it looks better than any other way. So this is the way I normally go to. Then we'll let them dry just like that. Now one way to chop them off is to use a flush cut trim saw and just cut them nice and flat. But there's another way you can do it too if you have the means to do it, and that's with a bandsaw. The bandsaw does it way faster and way smoother. Then I'll just sand them nice and smooth with an orbital sander. Now I don't quite have the fitment quite right for the inside of the main box, so I'm probably going to have to touch this up again later on. But yeah, when you're done, that's how it'll look right there. And we got more sanding. Lots and lots more sanding. Oh shit! Come on. Please work. Please work. Please work. Oh. I think we're good. Whew. So let that be a lesson in checking your switches before you plug in your equipment. But anyway, back to trying to get this thing to fit inside the box nice and tightly. I'm going to go over all the edges with a sander to try to knock a little bit off because I have it fitting a little bit too tight right now. So I'm going to beat it up with the sander a little while to get it to have a little more comfortable of a fit. Okay, I got it fitting pretty comfortably right now, but I understand that seasonal changes can cause wood movement. So I'm going to put some holes in there. That way if the seasons change and it causes it to get tighter, you can pull it out. So we're going to use the tape trick to try to keep my edges nice and smooth and run the Forstner bit through there. Ha 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 ha. Well, that's a proper disaster, so it looks like I'm going to have to sand the bottom and paint it instead of using poly on the bottom of this one. Alright, so I'm going to use about 3 coats of the spray-on poly, and between the coats I do some light sanding with some really fine sandpaper, like somewhere around the 400 range, and just to get that nice and smooth finish. This is one of my favorite finishes to use because it's super easy to do, and it always turns out pretty great. Alright, this is the finished piece. Everything fits in there nice and tightly, just the way I imagined it. So I'm pretty psyched with how it turned out. And the greatest thing about it is it's got a storage compartment underneath it so you can hide some snacks. So that's the most important part of the office right there. But if you like this build, do me a favor, hit that like button. If you want to see more builds like this one, hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. That way it lets you know the next time I post a video just like this. But until next time, get some inspiration and build something awesome.